All right, everybody. Hey, so much. This is Pastor Stephen Owens from Mount Calvary Baptist Church. We have a great guest on this morning, getting ready for Lead Well, which is going to be at Mount Calvary Baptist Church, May 17th and 18th. But this morning, I have the privilege of talking to Dr. Richard Blackaby, and super excited for him to be on our podcast this morning. Dr. Blackaby, how you doing there?
That's great. It's good to be with you.
Awesome, awesome. Well, let me tell you, I got your book right here.
Oh, I recognize that.
Yes. So super excited about that. I have received a lot of encouragement from your book and super excited about you being able to come to Lead Well this year. So just wanted to get on real quick and kind of just talk a little bit about spiritual leadership, the topic we're going to be talking about. So why is it needed? Why is spiritual leadership needed?
If you look at history, you look at the Bible, every time there was a problem, God raised up a leader. God could have just spoken a word and removed the problem. He could have just waved his hand and the enemy army would have been routed. Instead, God always raised up a leader. And he chose, I mean, he didn't have to do it that way. That's just the way he's done it. He works through leaders. And so whenever there's a problem, whenever society is going through a difficult time, God's answer is always to work through leaders. And so we live in a troubled time right now. That's not breaking news for anybody. Society is a disaster. Internationally, things are a disaster. Everywhere you look, there are problems. And the way God addresses problems is he raises up leaders. And of course, the leaders don't do all the work, but they mobilize God's people to address problems. And so if there was ever a time for people to be responding to God's call to lead, and not just to lead, but to lead well, to lead the way God wants them to. The two things I'd say with that, one is God always works through leaders, and in particularly troublesome times, God often takes people's leadership to another level. And there are many people who've been pastoring for years. I have guys all the time come up to me and say, Richard, I've been preaching for 40 years. I've been pastoring for 35 years. I'd say, great. Are you pastoring the same way you were 35 years ago? Because you're serving in a different world now. Post-COVID, it's a different world now. Post 9/11, it's a different world now. There's just a number of turning points in society and culture that if you haven't been growing through all those different times, if you're still back and preaching the way you did 30 years ago, leading the way you did 30 years ago, then I'm just going to guess, without knowing any other statistic, that your church is struggling right now and it's not growing like it ought to be. I'll just bet on that, because if you're not growing, you're becoming out of date. And leaders today need to be at their very best and beyond what they've ever led before. And so appreciate when you have a conference like this. I'll tell you what, any leader worth their salt is going to take every opportunity they can just to add another tool to their belt, gain another insight that will help them. If they can just lead a little bit better, all their people will be forever grateful that they took time to read a book, to go to a conference, to get a coach, whatever it takes. But don't, do whatever you have to so that you lead better than you ever have before.
Yeah, such a good word. And I appreciate that, understanding like the importance of understanding that this is a different time and understanding the season and the generation that you're in right now. So what would be as you're looking around the leadership landscape, some pitfalls that you see currently in our culture or in church leadership? What would you say to some of those pitfalls?
And there's a number, of course. One that I just see these days is that a lot of God's leaders, a lot of pastors are disoriented. This sounds crazy, but they're disoriented to God. In their church and their leadership, they'll say this all the time. They'll say, Rich, I'm doing the best I can. And I'll say, well, you're not called to do that. You're called to do the best God can. I'm not concerned about what you think the church needs. What is it God's doing? And I'll get a bunch of pastors who will just give me a blank look, like they don't have a clue. And their church is declining, their church isn't growing, and all they're doing is running around to conference trying to learn a method. And I would say you don't need to learn a method. You need to learn how to lead. Mm-hmm. But the way you lead God's way is you learn to recognize his prompting, and you become spirit-led, and you have the Spirit's power upon what you do. And I could promise you, God is not obligated to bless your plan. He blesses his plans. Long ago, got tired of trying to plead with God to bless my ideas. And now I just ask God, what's your idea? Let me get on board with that. And then you always bless that because it's your plan and it's what you want to happen. It's what you want to succeed. And I'll tell you what, you align your life, your church with what God wants to do, And it's amazing what you start to see happening. So one is just quit trying to do your best and start doing God's best. Your people deserve more than your best. They deserve God's best. Don't settle for less than that. And a second thing I've kind of alluded to is just a big pitfall is leaders stop growing. They stop growing. In fact, I had a professor in seminary who was not a very good professor, and I didn't learn much from him. But he did make one statement I never forgot. He said he used to go if he was ever asked to go and maybe speak at a church, and he was brought into the pastor's study beforehand. He said, and I don't know why this guy would have ever been asked to preach in a church because he was pretty boring, but he apparently he was now and then. And he said whenever he went into a pastor's office, he would look at the books on the shelf and try to figure out what year the man died. And which is a very cynical thing to say, but what he meant was if you can't find a book that was published in the last 20 years, then you realize that the guy quit growing 20 years ago. He quit reading. And a lot of guys, I mean, and so I thought at the time that was a very cynical, negative thing to say, but I've been in a lot of pastors' offices, and I like looking at the books on the shelves. And I remember one pastor, great guy, like real nice guy. I liked him as a person. His church never grew. It never grew. I mean, he was in ministry for over 40 years. His church never grew. And one time I was in it, and I couldn't figure out why, because he's a nice guy. He's faithful. So I got in his office one day, and you could tell, like the year he graduated from seminary was about the last year he had a current book. And after that, he just, he didn't read any. He never read a book on preaching in 40 years. And guess what? His preaching never improved in 40 years. Never worked on his theology, never worked on leadership, no books on leadership. And the guy desperately needed to lead better. And so I just think what a shame for God's people to be led by people who just don't want to make the effort to grow. And then I get around other pastors, boy, they're reading all the time. Every time you're around, one of the questions I often ask people, Steve, when I'm around a pastor is, what have you been reading lately that's really challenging you, that's really stretching you? And a lot of times they'll say, "Oh, I just got this book. Have you read it yet? It's eating my lunch, and it's really stretching me. I've never thought about this, and I'm already, I'm thinking about taking my deacons through this book together and just growing together." And then I ask other people, what are you reading? And they'll say, I don't have time to read. I'll say, well, you're pastoring a church of 50 people full time. Like, what are you telling me you can't make time to read even a chapter a week?
Right.
Yeah. And I just think that the poor church, they're getting the same thing rehashed year after year because this he's not learned anything new. He's just giving them what he already knows. And looking at his church, it's clear he doesn't know enough. He needs to know more, but not driven. It's like, I've got a job now. I don't have to keep improving myself anymore. And I would say, well, just the opposite. You got people who've called you and put their trust in you as a leader. You owe it to them to keep growing. And so you see pastors, especially, they're disoriented to God. They don't talk about what God is doing. And you see pastors that are not growing, that year after year after year, it's just the same stuff rehashed. And especially with what the church is facing today, the church needs a lot more than that.
Oh, that is so good. So that the old cliche is still true, right? Leaders are leaders, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I fly a lot. I'm around a lot of business people, secular, business people, and reading is not out. I mean, I know a lot of people use Kindle and electronic books now, or audio books, and that's fine. But there's still lots of old-fashioned books out there too. People are still reading. At least people that appear to me to be successful and busy and in demand are people that keep increasing their repertoire all the time. I've got stacks of books all around me. I never go anywhere. I don't even go, to a restaurant. I never fly on a trip, on a plane. I never go I never go pick someone up at the airport unless I've got a book with me. I don't go to the dentist unless I've got a book so I can read in the waiting room because there's just too much I still need to learn.
Amen. It's so encouraging. And even when you think about just the importance of sanctification, right? I mean, we're growing, right? Trying to be more like Jesus and holistically, and that would include our leadership. So, so encouraging.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to get one question in, and I know you got to run, you got some other meetings to do, but what was the passion and thought behind the book Spiritual Leadership?
Yeah, well, I went to seminary and earned a couple of degrees while I was there, spent several years there, and I had a good experience. I learned a lot. But you know what? In two different seminary degrees, I never had one class on leadership. I had hours of classes on Hebrew and Greek, which I don't mean just to put down, but I don't know that all those hours of Hebrew, I don't think I've ever had a conflict in my church yet because of my Hebrew. But so I got to my church and I was so excited and I finally get to the work. And I tell you what, my church was a troubled church. It had a lot of problems and there was dysfunction all over the place. There were landmines that you couldn't help but step on. And this church had just been through everything you could imagine a church could struggle with. And it's my first church. The pastor that was there before me actually had a nervous breakdown trying to fix that church and left. And that's my first church. I'm cutting my teeth on something that drove an experienced veteran pastor to the brink of despair. And so it didn't take me very long to realize that even with the great seminary education I'd had, I didn't know how to lead. And part of the problem, and I've been a seminary president, and so I believe in seminaries. I think they're great. But in my day, it's changed a bit now, but in my day, none of your professors were necessarily leaders. In fact, most of your professors had never successfully pastored a church themselves. They just knew the New Testament. They just knew theology, but they had never led a church. And so you've got a bunch of people trying to teach you to do something they've never done themselves. And so that's not a great combination. And so I began just to frantically say, well, what am I going to do here? I don't know what to do. I've never been taught what to do. So I did a couple of things. One, I cried out to God and said, God, help me. And then two things, I started reading. I don't know if I'd ever read a book on leadership all the way through. I was never required to in seminary. I began picking up every book I could on leadership. And number two, I began getting around other pastors and just asking lots of questions. I'll just tell you, Steve, one of the things I've noticed about pastors, I've been a minister all my life. I grew up in a pastor's home. My dad was a pastor. I've been a pastor. I'm a minister still to this day. I don't pastor a local church right now, but I'm in the ministry. And ministers are an insecure lot. Can I just tell you that? We'll give advice all day to people who need help, but it's like pulling teeth to get us to admit we need help and to ask for help. I've known pastors literally will leave the ministry in discouragement and despair before they'll pick up the phone and call a pastor down the street and ask if they just have lunch with them and pray with them. And so I just wasn't going to be one of those guys. If I was called to be a minister, I was going to be the best one I could be. And so I just had to humble myself and call veteran pastors and say, listen, could I just go for lunch with you? Could I just stop by? I got about 5 questions. I really just need help thinking through. I got a pastor to be a prayer partner with me, and we walked together through all kinds of problems. I developed a pastors group, and we met twice a month. And we would just talk about issues that pastors struggle with. And we'd read books together and we'd encourage each other. And I had to develop my own kind of learning groups. But I just kept reading and reading and learning. And really the spiritual leadership book that you reference, so much of the material in there just comes from books that I read over the years in my own pursuit of leadership. And so it's really a treasure trove of the best stuff that I found as I was searching how to be a better leader. And I just helped put that in that book with my dad's material into one place. And so that's kind of a collection, a summary of a lot of the best stuff that I found. That's why we ultimately wrote that book. Was I just began to realize leadership is the key. The better the leader. And, it's interesting because I know people that'll say, well, it's just all up to God, It's not up to the pastor to grow the church. That's God does that. I just have to be faithful. Well, that's partially true. Mm-hmm. But if it was all up to God, then wouldn't every church be growing? Why is it that God grows some churches and not other churches? Doesn't he love every church? Doesn't he want every church to reach its community? Yeah. So if it was just simply, you just sit back and let God grow your church, I would assume they'd all be bursting at the seams. But the fact is that every time you see a church that's doing well, you find a healthy leader nearby, a leader that's willing to grow and do things God's way. And I've known pastors. I don't know. I could tell you countless stories of a pastor who came to a church that was running 200 people when he got there, and 20 years later, it's running 17 people now.
Mm.
They've grown the church from 200 to 17,
Wow.
and then but then they'll say, I'm being faithful. We're not seeing any growth, but I'm being faithful. I would say, no, you're not. No, you're not. Faithfulness is not just showing up and doing the same thing that hasn't worked for years. That's not faithfulness. That's futility. You know what Jesus said when he gave someone gave him one talent and he came back and had two? He said, well done, good and faithful servant. The faithful servants are the ones that grew what God gave them, multiplied what God gave them. The unfaithful servant is the one who, and he didn't even lose anything. He didn't even decline. He just was plateaued. And that was enough to call him a worthless servant. So I'm not saying that you never have tough places. I'm not saying that if your church isn't just growing to be a mega church that you're not faithful. What I am saying is don't assume that you're being faithful just because you keep doing the same thing over and over again. I work with business leaders as well as pastors. I work with very high-end business leaders. And if they're doing something that's not working, they don't do it for very long, or else they go bankrupt. But a pastor who hasn't grown their church in 20 years will keep doing the same thing, because they'll say, well, that's just how I've always preached. That's how I've always led. And I'll say, but it's not bearing fruit. Yeah. Why would you keep doing something that's fruitless? I don't care if you've done it 20 years. That's just craziness. Don't think that you're going to get a well done from God when for 20 years you were doing something that didn't work and you never changed. You never went to God and asked him if there wasn't a better way. Never sought counsel from a pastor friend or somebody. Never hired a coach just to walk with you for a few months. You just kept doing what you've always done and got the same lousy results. Don't call yourself faithful. That's not faithful. That's stubbornness. And so I just have found I just have become increasingly passionate about leadership, and it is about God. There's a lot of even Christian leadership that sound just like secular leadership. They talk like it's just all the leader and nothing to do with God. And I'd say that's not true either.
Right.
But there's both. You know, God's going to do what only he can do, but he's not going to do it if you're not in a position to receive it, and you're not even looking for it. And so I'd say, yeah, there's a role for God, there's a role for the leader. And biblically, when those two come together, awesome things happen. And so, you know, Steve, I would just kind of maybe conclude by just saying there's two things. I want to challenge leaders, and I was just with a bunch of leaders that lead some Fortune 500 companies, and here they are. A couple of them flew into the meeting on personal jets, and they took time off their jobs to fly in for a 24-hour intensive training session. I'll be doing another training session like that this coming week. They lead huge companies, and yet they'll take time out to fly across the country just to improve their leadership just a little bit more. And then I've got pastors whose churches haven't grown in 20 years, and they won't drive half a mile to go to a leadership meeting so that they can improve their leadership a little bit more, so the kingdom of God would prosper. And I don't know why that is. If people are trying to make more money, they'll fly across the world to enhance their leadership. And here we are serving the King of Kings, and we're too busy to go to a free conference on leadership. You know, I don't know what it is with people. I don't know if they understand what's at stake, but I've learned a long time ago, I've got one life to live. I've got one time of service for my King. And I do not want to be some lukewarm, mediocre servant of God who was just content just to keep doing things the same way when I had just as much opportunity to grow and learn and develop as anyone else. And I just chose not to do it. So whenever there's an opportunity to grow, if I could possibly do it, I make the time. And I'm there in the front row with my notepad and a pen and ready to go. And I'm going up to the speaker and asking questions. And I just want to, if it will help my people, it will bless my church, I'll be the last person to leave, the first one there, just so I can go home and have more tools now to serve with my people.
That is super encouraging. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to have my notepad and my pen ready and lead well, that's for sure. You know, and it's so encouraging, right? To just hear the importance of that when God looks at faithfulness, he's also looking for fruitfulness right? He
Yeah.
wants to see
Yeah.
us, produce some things for his
Stephen,
glory.
I would just so don't sound too negative. I'd look at any leader that's listening to this and say, I can promise you God can take your leadership to another level. I want you to have hope. If you've done everything you know to do and you can't get that church turned around, don't worry. God is not baffled by your church. God is not bewildered by the problems you're facing. But I'm telling you, you can't just keep doing what you've always done. So go to God. And whenever I have a leadership conference like the one that we'll be at, pray before you go there. Say, God, I need some answers. Here, in fact, maybe write them down. Here's a couple of questions I'm coming to the conference with, God. And my church desperately needs me to find some answers to these questions. So whether it's why I'm listening at this talks or I go up to the speaker in a break and I ask him my question, but I'm going to be looking for answers so be intentional. Don't just attend there tuned out, checking your cell phone throughout the meeting. Go in there saying, God, here's some things I really need to understand. I need to learn. And I'm coming here with an open heart. My dad and I did a leadership conference years ago. And after the first session, my dad and I had just spoken, and a pastor wasn't even sure he was going to come. Like, I don't have time. But he went, and he got so convicted after just the first session. He finally stepped out of the auditorium, and he was walking around the parking lot, just crying out to God, asking for forgiveness, that he had just gotten careless, gotten lazy, gotten cynical. And God had just so convicted him that God had so much more for him than what he was experiencing, that he just cried and cried in the parking lot. And when the break came and he finally came back in the building, his pastor friends found him and like, what's going on? And he just hugged them and said, pray for me. I've encountered God, and I just know things aren't going to be the same anymore. And so my prayer always, every time there's a meeting like that, is, God, would you encounter your chosen servants the same way and give them hope that as tough as it might be, you've got an answer. If they'll just make whatever adjustment you ask them to, pay whatever price to become the leader that God's called them to be, then these certainly can be the best days they've ever had as they've served their Lord.
Amen. Well, Dr. Blackaby, I appreciate you coming on to the podcast and encouraging us and challenging us. Like I'm excited, about
Good, good. Well, then God is at work.
yes, yes. And we look forward to seeing you and you being a part of Lead Well and just encouraging the pastors and church leaders up here in Northeast Ohio. And yeah, we look forward to you. And thank you
Well, I'm
so
looking forward to being with you. If you hear this and the Lord encourage you to come, be sure you come and shake my hand. Tell me who you are. I'd love to meet you while I'm there.
Thank you so much. All right, there, Doc. I appreciate you, and I'll be talking to you soon.
All right. Sounds good. Look forward to it.
Thanks so much. Have a good day.